Hey guys, welcome back to another Looked At with the DiGiCo and welcome back to the living room. In this video I'm going to be giving you a tour of the options section of the console and how I utilise them within my workflow. The options section can be found at the top tab here under options. And what this does is give you access to change certain parameters within the console. Just as a side note, there are loads of different options available, but they will depend on the console that you're working on. So because I'm working on an SD11, only the options available to change within an SD11 will be shown here. Also worth noting that some options will look different on different consoles. Also just want to draw your attention to this little message down the bottom here. It says options marked star are not saved in session files but remain set on the console. What this basically means is that the changes you're making are being made to the way the console works with your file and not to the file itself. So if you're starting up your console on a different file, you might want to go back through all of the options available to make sure you've checked the ones that you need. And one last thing, some options are active or inactive by default, so again, it's worth checking through. So our options are divided up into 10 different categories. First one we're going to look at is the Surface. Our first option within Surface is the touch keyboard. What this means is when you activate this, the console will automatically bring you up an on-screen keyboard display should you need to type any information into a text box. So for example, naming a channel or naming your file. It's really useful if you don't have a USB keyboard with you, maybe you're not carrying one. I personally use both. I always seem to have a USB keyboard with me, but I do activate this as well. Sometimes it's just easier rather than reaching into the drawer or somewhere over to the side when you can just tap it out on the screen. But if you're maybe naming quite a few channels, I can see why it might be easier for people to use a USB keyboard too. So having both can be quite useful. Our next option is the large LCD names. Now what this means is that when you activate with DBs or name only, you're giving yourself the option as to what you display on your Freyja displays in the little screens down here. So the standard option is a smaller text with the DBs available underneath when you move the fader. If you want to enable a larger name with the DBs, if you click just with DBs here, it will automatically change the text to a larger size. And if you don't want to see the DBs on your Freyja display, you can also just click name only. This is more of a personal option. It's whatever you find easiest and whatever information you need to be displayed. Next up, round to hold DBs display only. Now what this means is should you activate it, if you've also chosen to display the DBs on your Freyja displays, they will be rounded up to the next nearest number instead of showing you decimal places. Personally, I keep the decimal places in there. I like to have a more accurate reading, especially when I'm dealing with a monitor mix. However, I can see why some people might use it for just a straight ballpark figure if you're just trying to get a mix together, that kind of thing. And also, just so you know, if you do decide to take the DB decimal places off, it doesn't actually affect your level at all. It's purely for display. The next two that we come to are Auto Expand EQ and Auto Expand Dynamics. I'm going to introduce you guys to these together because they basically work in the same way, only with one affecting the display of the EQ and one affecting the display of the dynamics. So when you activate this and you go to your channel strip, if you make any changes to your channel processing using the onboard ports, it will automatically bring up an expanded view of whatever you're changing. So a quick example of this, if I was to go into my channel strip right here, if I make a change on the EQ of this channel, it will automatically bring up the expanded EQ view here. The same thing applies to the dynamics, so if I pick another channel and go ahead and change something on the dynamics, this will also have an auto expanded view that's brought up. Now the cool thing with this is not only can you choose to have this, you can also choose how long the display is on the screen for. I found this super useful in a rehearsal or a sound check scenario. If I'm going to make a change on anything, I do want to see in detail what I'm doing. However, I don't use it for when I'm mixing live, only because sometimes I just want to make a minimal change and I don't really need that flashing up every time I do change it. When I do activate this, I normally have the auto expand time set to about 6 seconds. It's normally enough time for me to have a look, check something else and then come back. However, you can change this auto expand time. All you need to do is click on the virtual pot just here, which will automatically assign control to the touch turn pot here. And then you wind it up and down depending on how long you want the time to be. So our next option is super interesting. This is Panotype. Now, full disclosure, I was really confused about this before I made this video. I ended up having to email Dan to ask him what the difference was because I wasn't entirely sure. So he very kindly informed me that type 1 panner is the traditional standard SD type of panner response. It's fairly linear. And type 2 is a more studio style pan response, which is actually a little bit more exponential. So there we go, you learn something new every day. I would actually be really interested to trial both of these side by side when I can. It would be really interesting to see how the sound image changes and what kind of response I can get from it. So if you guys were like me and you didn't know either, this is something cool to check out. The next option, the global quick select, is pretty self-explanatory. All it means is that you can define your quick select selection to either apply to the bank shown on the console currently or to all banks across your console. So next up we have the display snapshots overview option. When this is activated, the console will bring up a snapshot list, which you can have floating around anywhere on your master screen. You can drag and drop it wherever you want. It's pretty helpful to be able to have access to trigger your snapshots at any point, so I can see why most people would want to go ahead and use that. Personally, I actually use a macro to bring up my snapshot list. I tend to already have a few things floating around on my home screen, so I try and keep it as decluttered as possible, so I'm quite happy using this on a macro for now. Next up, we have a life-saving option. This is auto cancel second function. Personally, I think this is really useful because if you're anything like me, you'll probably forget. I forget quite a lot to turn off my second function, and I do end up doing God knows what to the rest of my channels in the meantime. So with this enabled, the console will automatically turn it off, again after a predetermined time like we did earlier on with the auto expand EQs and dynamics. To assign a time, if you click on the virtual pot again and use your touch turn pot here to change it. And last one on our surface page here, we have bank switch assigned to screen. When this is enabled, what it means is when you're switching between your fader banks, the fader bank that you are selecting will automatically appear on your master screen. Now, I think this is probably super useful if you're trying to troubleshoot, but for me, it kind of interferes with my workflow, so I tend to leave this off. So next tab is the faders tab, and the first thing we come to is fader assigned channel. What this means is when it's enabled, you can go into your channel strip, put your finger on the fader of the channel that you want to use, and it will automatically highlight it within your control strip. It also means that all the control strip controls are then assigned to that one channel for you to make changes to. I like to think of it as highlighting the channel that you're editing. Again, I would probably leave this for a rehearsal or a sound check kind of scenario. It's nice to be able to keep an eye on the channel you're actually editing with that function. However, as you can see, when I touch the faders with my fingers, the highlight will dance around all over the place, so I tend to not use this when I'm mixing live. Next up is a really clever little option called the Fader DB Deten. What this does is has the console create a virtual notch at 0 dB that you can feel when you press the fader. I'll try and show you on these faders here. If I bring this one down, push it up, when it gets to 0 there's a bit of resistance and you have to push on through in order to go above 0 dB. You can also choose which faders in the console are affected by this. I actually have it on everything because I do find it super useful, especially when I'm mixing. If I'm taking my eyes off the fader, I do like to be able to feel if I'm going to reach 0 dB or not. Next up, we have fader touch control. This is another really useful option. When it's enabled, it protects the faders from being moved by anything other than your hands. So, for example, if I take this back to free, so nothing's protected at the moment, I can move these faders quite happily with my hands and with my notebook. However, if I put this to protected, I can still move all the faders with my hands, but they won't move from their positions with the notebook. This is super useful if you're going to be leaving your console alone for any amount of time, so say that weird time between after sound check and before show, or if you're in a really crowded environment with lots of other people around you. It will prevent your faders being moved by accidental nudges or people putting their phones on the console, that kind of thing, and it's just a really good protective measure. I actually have this on all the time. Our last option here is quite interesting. This is control group faders control aux send. Now the little message that comes up on here is when aux sends assigned to faders, control groups trim sends. I don't know about you guys, but I kind of had to break that down a little bit to fully understand what it does in order to kind of tell you. I know what it does and I use it all the time, but being able to actually communicate that I found quite difficult. So here is my attempt, and I'll try and give you a demonstration at the same time. Okay, so if we enable this option here, I can then go ahead and pick up my auxes. I want to assign my aux sends to faders. So at the moment, to do that, I'm going to PFL this mix. Then, if I leave this mix in PFL and go back through to my control groups, pick up the control groups, and here they are. Now, at the moment, you can see all of the faders have snapped to the middle. So at the moment, what that means is they have now become plus or minus 18 dB trims for any of the channels that are housed within those control groups within that mix. The easiest way I found to think of this is using them to mix within an aux send. So for a quick example, the person I'm sending this mix to tells me that they want a bit less drums overall. Instead of having to go through and individually take down drum channels from the inputs, I can just use the drum control group and bring that down. So yeah, this is something I do still use and I find it really helpful. Next up is our solo tab. And the first thing we come to here is solo displays insert and output. What this means is the console will give you the option to display any internal graphic EQs, effects, or even waves that you've got on a channel as soon as you solo the channel. So I'll just give you a quick example of this. If I go ahead and activate the insert option, I can go into my channel strip, pick up this blank channel here, which has got a graphic EQ inserted over it. Now, if I was to solo that channel, it will automatically bring up the graphic EQ display on screen. And you can do the same for an internal effect or waves as well. As I've said already, there are certain things that I find much more useful in a rehearsal or a soundcheck environment as opposed to a live environment. With this option, I would definitely be using it in a rehearsal environment, but when it comes to live, I might not use it so much. Even though it is useful to bring up at the touch of a button, I don't really want everything about every channel brought up every time I solo it, but it is absolutely brilliant for when you're making those changes and you need to see it straight away. Next up, and similar to the one before, solo displays all aux sends. So what this means is when I go ahead and activate this, if I then solo a channel, it will bring up all of the auxes that this channel is actually being sent to. So here we can see all of the aux sends that this channel is being sent to individually. This is definitely a really useful option, especially if you've got everybody asking for the same thing. This can be really useful for making a change across all mixes really quickly. I might find sometimes that a talkback channel can be too loud for certain people and they'll all say the same thing at the same time. Can we have less of so and so? So rather than me having to pick up each individual mix and take it out, if I have this enabled, I can quite easily go across and turn it down in everybody's mix. The next two, again, I'm going to do in conjunction with each other. We have solo assigns aux to faders and solo assigns aux to rotaries. What this means is when you solo an aux, the aux sends will be assigned to either the channel faders or the channel rotaries for you to make the mix with. I am very much a fan of the aux to faders, so I will use that at any given opportunity. In addition to having this activated all the time, I use this in conjunction with a macro that actually brings up the aux send to faders options too. So I then have two different ways to access my mixes. I do find that really useful to have both in case I'm working with a smaller console or in case my screen's getting a bit cluttered. With the rotaries option, instead of assigning the aux sends to the faders, it actually assigns them to these under-screen rotaries here. Next up, we have aux to faders includes pans. What this means is when aux to faders is active, for a stereo aux, you'll then be able to use the under-screen rotaries as aux panning. Next up, we have solo assigns channel. Now all this means is when you go back into your channel strip and you solo a channel, it will automatically highlight it and bring it into the control strip. This for me is pretty intuitive as well, because if I'm soloing something, it kind of means I want to then have control of it and to be able to see it. In addition to that, we also have solo assigns channel also assigns screen. So what that means is when solo assigns channel is active, you can also choose to have the solo assign the channel to the screen at the same time. So for example, as I've just soloed that channel, it's actually been brought onto the main screen at the same time. Again, this is really useful if you are soloing something because it means it's right there in front of you instead of you having to dig around and find it. Especially if you've already turned off bank switch assign screen from the previous tab. Next up, we have solo reverts to output. So what that means is, bear with me, if you have an output soloed that you're listening to, let's say, and you go ahead and you solo an input afterwards, if you then take that input solo off, it will automatically revert back to the output that you'd already soloed. Normally, without that on, after you'd cancel the solo of the input, nothing would be soloed anymore. However, with this in place, it means that once you turn that input solo off, you're automatically back in your soloed output mix. Now, I find this super useful for creating mixes because 9 times out of 10, I will go in to a mix, solo the mix itself, and then solo some of the inputs. And if I don't have this on, I'm going to be brought straight back to square one and I'll have to go and do it all again. So this is a really, really useful tool that I find really helpful. Next up, we have line check listen. Now what this does, it gives you the option between either solo 1 or solo 2 to use when you're doing your line check listen for your input channels. So obviously this is the choice between solo 1 and solo 2 on the console itself. And the line check function is found in the Audio I/O setup page. So if we go into Audio I/O, I'll show you on the only thing I've actually got connected, which is the local I/O here. But you'd go ahead, you'd click line check, you click the channel you want to listen to, and then go ahead and listen. And then you'll be listening through either solo 1 or solo 2, depending on what you've chosen on that menu. So the last one is outputs AFL only. Fairly self-explanatory, it just means that it gives you the option between having your outputs in AFL or PFL. Next up, we have got the Gangs tab. This basically lets you choose which channel parameters are copied to all gang members if you make any. They've divided it up into input channels, aux outputs, group outputs, and matrix outputs. And as you can see here, hopefully, you get the option to choose between various controllers. So just to break this down as an example, every time you make a gang of channels, you're basically telling the console what you want these channels to have in common within that gang. Something like a DJ left-right, let's say, you might want to have all of the same controllers except pan, because you still want to have the differentiation between left and right. Next up is delays. Now what this does is it gives you the option to change the units of delay that you see displayed for your inputs, outputs, or effects channels. And as you can see here, we've got the choice of seconds, feet, meters, BPM, or frames. So this will just completely depend on the application of your work. If you are, for instance, mixing sound for vision, you might want to look at frames. I have a background of system teching, so I'm really used to using seconds for my delay units. Next up, we have our Disable tab. Now what this does is it gives you a choice of 2 options, at least on this console, that you can choose to take control from the surface buttons themselves. So for example, we can choose to deactivate our hard mute button on the console, and we can also choose to deactivate the snapshot previous and next buttons on the console. The screen controls for these options will still be available, but what it does is disable the physical button on the console. Similarly to the fader touch control, it can basically just help avoid any accidental knocks, especially with things like mutes and scene nexts. They are 2 things that you really don't want to accidentally touch while you're mixing live. So it's just another element of protection that they've incorporated into the console. Okay, so moving on, we also have the brightness tab. This is super simple. All it does is let you control the brightness of certain elements of the console. So here we have a control for the meter LEDs, here we have one for the LCD displays, and here we have one for the surface LEDs. Now if I go ahead and assign this to the touch turn rotary here, it will basically, I'm not sure if you can see, but it brings up the LCD display's brightness. And I can turn that all the way up and all the way down. The same would apply obviously for the meter LEDs down here, and for the surface LEDs around all of the buttons. These are super useful for if you're in a really, really dark place or a really, really light place. If you have the sun on the console, sometimes it's better to make everything brighter so you can actually see it. Similarly, if you're in a really, really dark environment, you don't want to have too much light coming off your console, so it can be good to turn these down too. So our next tab along is the meters tab. And within this, you can define what PPM you're going to be using on your console. Now, initially, this wasn't something I'd ever explored. I'd always just taken for granted that you could use the SD default and that would work. But after doing some of my own research and also watching one of Matt Napier's last looked at with the DiGiCo videos, I actually realised you can really utilise this. It has a lot of different functions for loads of different applications. I think probably the most common one that anyone would come across is probably for use during broadcast. However, I'm still quite happy to stay with the SD default for now, although looking through I was quite keen to try out the Nordic PPM, so maybe I will at some point. So as you can see, we have 8 different options available to us. We can stay with the SD default, or we can change to digital, DIN, Nordic, EBU, UK, ABC or CBC. Also, just to note, when you're bringing up these presets, only the attack rate and the release rate will change. It leaves the peak and the overs hold as user definable options. And within this page, you can also make changes to your meter bridge options. This basically lets you tell the console which part of the signal chain it should display on the meter. And lastly, you can make changes to your overview channel sizes. So when you bring up a channel overview onto a master screen, you can dictate how large or small it appears. So next we come to our console tab. First option available to us is load startup session. So what this means is when this is enabled, the console will always load the startup session when it's turned on. If it's not enabled, it will just start up in its default state. This might want to be something that you think about enabling if you're working on files for long periods of time over several days. So for instance, if you're in a rehearsal session and you leave one night, you can turn the console off, but when you turn it on in the morning, you know that it's going to load the same file straight away. If it's not enabled for whatever reason, all it means is that you have to go into files and load your session. Our next option is save startup session. This basically ensures that whenever you quit, your startup session is automatically saved. But if it's not enabled for whatever reason, the console will just start up in the same state it started off with. Our next option is possibly the most important option that we have available to us, auto save recovery session. This is your best friend. It allows the console to automatically save the current session that you're working on at a predetermined time, which you can control again using the touchscreen encoder. So you can set the auto save time from anywhere from 1 minute to 99 minutes. I tend to have my autosave time quite quick, normally between 5 and 10 minutes. But again, it's a personal preference. Some people might be more secure having a really low autosave time, and some people might be happier with a longer one. So moving on, we have default positions. All this means is it enables all windows that are open to return to their default sizes after startup. Next up, we have enable external waves. So for those of you using Waves and Waves plugins, you'll want to have this enabled. An important thing to note for this option is that if you do enable it, you will have to restart the console in order to effect the change. Next, with Enable Optical, you can basically switch between which optical loops you're going to be using. You can choose between off, loop 1, loop 2 and both, but again, this will require a restart to reset it. And our next restart required option is Enable Console Network. This lets you turn on networking options for remote computers or redundant pairs. And that ties in quite nicely with our next option here, which is mirroring mode. This basically determines how the console will work with another console or an engine when it's mirrored on a network. And for this, there are 4 different options. We have one-way, remote, expander, and full mirror. So just a quick introduction. One-way is a way to remotely monitor what another device is doing. It basically means you can see what the device is doing, but you can't make any changes to it. Next, we have remote. This is normally used when you have something like a computer being used as a remote control for your console. Expander is quite an interesting one. This can be used as like an extension of your console. It will follow any surface layout changes that are made, but you can also select different banks on either of the different consoles. So for instance, you could have 2 people mixing on the same file on 2 different consoles. Our last option is full mirror, and that basically does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a full mirror of another device that's on the network. And this means that all functions on one device are mirrored exactly to another. This would be quite good for something like having a redundant console, maybe in a tour setup. Our final tab is the status tab. So here we have the option to display certain parts of the console status to the master screen. The first one we have is display system status indicators. This basically lets you display the system status of the console so that you can monitor things like hardware and connections. So just as an example, if I click on here to enable it, it will bring up a status display just here. And as you can see, it monitors certain things like power supplies, the engine, local I/O, surfaces, timecode, etc. As you can see, we have a lot of green OKs here, which is great. There's an error for whatever reason or something isn't connected, there'll be a red box with error inside. Some of the statuses do let you click on them in order to bring up their own diagnostics page, just like so. You can also drag this guy around your screen to place it wherever you like. I find that I keep this on most of the time. I find it really useful on startup just to have an overview of the status of everything that's going on in the console, and it can quite quickly help you to troubleshoot and determine if there are any errors. So next up we have display system alerts. This enables the console to display a warning to you on the screen in case of any potential errors. Again, as with the previous options, you can dictate how long this error message is displayed for as well, using the touchscreen encoder. I personally think this is really useful. I like to be made aware if there is a problem with the console, especially if I have my status indicator covered up too. Next up, we have another really useful option. This is display overs alerts. What this means is if an input or output over indicator is triggered, a warning will be displayed on the master screen. This is a really useful tool for troubleshooting. For instance, if you have a channel that's feeding back quite loud, you will be able to then see any of the auxes that it's sent to. Our last and final option is display messages until acknowledged. All it means is that any error messages or warnings that are displayed on the screen will stay on the screen until you manually disable them. This is really useful if you're going to be away from your console for a certain amount of time, or if you step away to have a break. If you're not there to see your console, you'd like to know if there are any errors present before you go back into mixing again. So that's just about it for this video. Again, I hope you guys have found it useful. I certainly did. I had to do a little bit of my own research just to make sure I was up to speed on everything, and it was really interesting. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe, and I will see you all again soon.